Hi there, I'm Kyra, and I make fake Pokemon, or fakemon, in my spare time. A lot of fakemon designers out there like the idea of having their creations look official, and to achieve that look, they try to emulate the art style of the official Pokemon series artist, Ken Sugimori. In this video, I'll be demonstrating one way to color and shade your fakemon image so that it approximates his work. This guy here is the fakemon I'll be working with today, and when I'm done, he'll look something like this. So before we get started, there are just a few things that I'd like to... First of all, as you may or may not be able to tell, I'm going to be working in Photoshop CS5 for this tutorial. You really should be able to perform the exact same steps in any art program that supports layers, from Photoshop to Paint Tool Sci to the GIMP. It's just a matter of knowing where to find the settings that you're looking for. I'm also not going to go over creating the initial line art here. As you can see, I've already got this. I'll assume you already have your line art in the computer too. Just remember to work with an image that's as large as possible. The larger it is, the better it is. This is at least 2,000 pixels tall here. And I have several reference images loaded up here, some of Ken Sugimori's actual artwork. What I've done is I've chosen several images that are similar in at least some ways to the image that I'm drawing. So in this case, since I have a bird who's standing and he has his wings folded against his side, I have images of standing birds with wings folded against their sides, and Dodrio because he's tall. And then, of course, as you're working, just make sure you remember to save it off, and you don't want to lose your work or anything like that in case something happens to your computer while you're working. Alright, so let's get started with the color then. I always like to put each color on its own layer, and all of the color layers will go underneath my line art layer here. Since I already have a finished image, I'm just going to be taking the colors from this. You'll probably be getting your colors from the color picker here. Now, when I'm choosing colors and laying them on the image, I like to make sure that everything that's the same color is on the same layer. So over here, everything that's this shade of red is on the same layer. Everything that's this dark gray is on the same layer. So let's get started. I like to start with the base colors first, the ones that are in a lot of places. So we'll take this gray here with the eyedropper. Now I'm going to create a new layer underneath the line art layer, drag it down, name it something so that I can remember what it is, light gray. And then I'm going to take the magic wand tool up here, it might be buried under the quick selection tool, or you can use the shortcut W. And with the tolerance set to 0, I'm going to go to the line art layer and select all the sections of the image that are the color I'm going to be working with, in this case light gray. So there's this large part here, and then there's also this little part underneath his wing. If you want to select more than one area at the same time, you hold down the Shift key, and it'll let you add more than one part to your selection. Once that's all selected, we go up here to the Select menu, and go down to Modify and Expand. And then expand it by 1, sometimes you can use 2 pixels. The reason we're doing this is, you see, it pushes the selection out just a little bit more. It grows the selection so that it kind of runs into the line art. So that when we come back down to our first color layer, this gray, and choose the bucket fill, and just fill it in, the color will go a little ways under the line art. There won't be any gaps left between the line art and the color. I've got that layer of color down. I can now do the same thing with the next layer. So let's do that lighter red, and a new layer, get the color for his mask, select that on the line art layer, expand it, and then just bucket fill. You can use the shortcut G and fill that in, and you just continue that way until the entire image is colored in. Alright, so we're going to jump ahead a little bit here. I've gone and filled in all the rest of the colors according to what I wanted. But now we come to the tricky part, the shading and the highlighting. Now this is a little bit harder to teach because it does require a lot of practice to get right, and a lot of experimenting, because what you end up using is going to vary a little bit from image to image. So I can't give you any exact settings or anything to use, because different images, different colors will require different kinds of shading. And it also is going to vary a little bit depending on exactly what kind of Sugimori art you're trying to emulate, because his style does actually change a little bit from game to game and generation to generation. There are subtle differences between the way he did the art for Diamond and Pearl, like with this haunch growth, to the way he did the Heart Gold and Soul Silver art, like Noctowl, to even the black and white art. There are differences, and once you see those differences, you might decide you like one style better than the other. I tend to prefer the Diamond and Pearl style art. And even then, I've added a couple of changes in my own little twists as well. So while you're shading and adding the highlights, just play with different possibilities and see what you think gives you the best result. We're going to point out a few other basic things before we go any further. Look at Noctowl here. The first step to proper shading and highlighting for any picture, not just Sugimori art, is determining your light source, or the direction that the light is coming from. The parts of the image that are facing the light will be lit up because the light is hitting them directly, and they'll be more likely to have highlights, whereas the parts that are further away or they're blocked by something will be in shadow. Sugimori-style shading, because it's a sort of cartoony look, it's relatively simple, and usually only has one primary light source, which comes from the top left, as you can see here. So there's highlights here on the top left of Noctowl where the light's hitting it, and down here in the bottom right the tail is in shadow because it's much further away from the light source. The second thing to point out, and we're going to zoom in a little bit to see this, is that there are going to be, we'll call them multiple levels of shading and highlighting. If you look at this sort of line here, where the shading on Noctowl's wing begins, that's done by adding multiple levels of shading. This lighter part here actually extends all the way around, and that's the first level, and then he added another slightly darker layer on top of that to add a little more depth, so it's more than just one flat color. It's a little weird to just talk about it, but you'll see more about it as we move forward with the image. We've got the references. It's always useful to keep them in mind. Like I said, it's a similar shape, so I can use this to determine, oh, well, this is how the shading falls on the wing, so always keeping your references in mind. Let's move on back. Alright, so let's give this a shot then. I've got all my color layers here. Well, we're going to create a new layer, still under the line art, but above the last color you added, and call it something like Shade 1, and this is going to be the first level of shading, that slightly lighter shading. Now, this sounds a little counterintuitive, but you're going to want a very, very dark blue color for your shading, so we're going to run over here to the blue. Something in this area of the color picker, it's going to start to look black. It shouldn't be black, there should be some blue, but something around this color here will do nicely. Or, just experiment. You may want something slightly lighter, slightly darker, you find as you go through your own artwork. So now that I have this color, I'm going to take the brush, and I want a soft-edged, round brush. Doesn't need to be anything fancy, just something like this. And for an image this size, it's set at 90 pixels right now. It shouldn't be too big compared to the rest of the image. This size will do. So, to begin the shading, I like to work on the shading one color at a time, like with the regular coloring. You can simply select all of a color at once. So for example, if I want to start with the light gray here, I can come over to my layers panel, hover over this little thumbnail of the light gray, and hold down Control and click on the thumbnail part. And so while I'm still up here on the shading level, that's selected all of the gray, and I can work with that. If you need a little more control over the areas you select, for example, if there's overlapping, like if I wanted to give extra attention to the details of each of these feathers, I can do something similar with the line art that I did with the colors. Go to the line art layer, use the magic wand tool, select the specific section you're interested in. This time you're going to want to expand it because you want the shading to go under the sides of the line art, remember, and then I can come back and work on the shading. We're going to work on the gray first. Now, keeping our light source in mind, I'm going to go from the top left, and remembering that you can check your references to see how the shapes go, how the shading kind of curves around the wing and the body. I'm going to start shading. Now, because I've made this selection, I can go like this and I'll stay inside the lines, and I just add the shading in a sort of curved shape here where it curves around his body like that, a little more under his head, wherever you think the light is not falling, where something's blocking the light. And if it looks a little messy, like maybe soft edges, they look a little too soft and that shape is kind of funny, I can take my eraser tool, which should also be set to a soft-edged round brush, but slightly smaller than the brush you're using to paint, so 70 pixels works here. And then I can come by and kind of clean up the edges, make it look a little neater, not quite so fuzzy, things like that. Now, I know you're all looking at this and thinking that looks absolutely ridiculous, that shading is much too dark. Well, that's fine, we're going to fix that right now. All you have to do is come over to the layer's opacity setting. Right now it's fully opaque, you can't see anything through all that really dark blue. But if I just slide the opacity down, you can see around this area, it starts to look more like the fainter shading on these. And again, there's no specific opacity level that I can give you. It's going to depend on your picture, it's going to depend on the style, the generation you're imitating, your diamond and pearl versus heart gold and soul silver. And most of all, it's going to depend on the colors you use. If you're on lighter colors, then it's going to need to be a little darker to stand out, whereas if I were on a darker color, and things like that. So just play with it, but usually in the vicinity of 20 to 40% opacity is going to look good for most colors. So we'll leave it at 33. That looks nice. And now, just working with the same shading layer, I'm going to come and do all the rest of the colors. So for example, the red, there's not going to be too much shadow on the red, but maybe a little bit here by the bottom of his mask, so on and so forth. And then, you know, the darker red start to come around onto the curvature of the wing, a little on his tail. And you just continue like this until you have the entire first level of shading as you need it. I've jumped ahead here, I've finished the rest of the shading around the wings, the rest of the colors, added a little extra right here beneath the mask. And I have that all still on the same shade 1 layer. Once you've completed that layer, we're going to go to the second level of shading that I mentioned, the shade 2, we'll call it. So add that, and that's colored pretty much the same way as the original shading. You just take your dark blue, maybe a slightly smaller brush. You may want to zoom in a little more now if you haven't already, so you can get a better look at what you're doing. And then again, you select the color you wanted to work with and start shading, but this time when you move in close to the edge of the first level, you leave a little bit of it showing. That doesn't look like much right now, but again, we just lower the opacity until we get something that looks good. I like the way it looks right here at about 30. And then you can see that second little line start to emerge, and you might want to make that a little thinner. And these lines occur right at the edge of where it starts to get lighter. So for example, here this area is completely in shadow. You're not going to see that line here, but it's approaching the highlight in this area, and you'll want the shading, it sort of fades off into the lighter colors. And again, you just carry that out for all the rest of the image, remembering to use the eraser to slim the lines down, make it a little smoother as you go. Now, not everywhere is going to necessarily need that second layer of shading. For example, I'm going to skip adding it to the lighter red here, but here in the darker red, especially in areas that are really blocked from the light, as they are here, then you're going to want to go ahead and add that second layer in. So I'm going to finish this up, and we'll skip ahead and just... Now, one last thing you may want to note once you've started to fill in all the shading is there might be a few sections that you might want to look even darker, and in that case you may want a third shade 3 layer, let's call it, that again does the exact same thing. Get the brush and go here and just kind of add a little extra. You should use this sparingly. There aren't a lot of areas with 3 layers of shading. And just fill in these extra dark patches. Don't want that on the wing. Like so. As needed, and then lighten that up. And this you can leave relatively dark. Put that at about 47%. And there you have the shading pretty much completed. So once you're satisfied with that, it is time to move on to the highlights. Now, the highlights are done almost identically to the shading. You're just going to be using a lighter color instead of a darker color, and you can use pure white for this. If you've got white already selected here, you can just flip the colors or press the X key. Create a light 1 layer for the first level of lighting, and you select the color you're going to work on, and with a brush, usually a slightly smaller brush, you start to add in the highlights. So we'll have a little patch on his chest there where the light's hitting it, and then lower the opacity. Now here, because this is such a light color, I'm not going to lower the opacity too much, because otherwise you're not going to be able to see that highlight at all. However, this creates a bit of a problem, because if I then come over to this dark red and start trying to add a highlight, that looks really bright. There aren't, if you look at the references, there are no highlights that are that bright, except in a few cases, like the little shine on Noctowl's beak here. In a situation like this, what I would actually do is create a second layer of highlight, and we'll call this light 1 dark, because it's going to go on these darker layers. So I can then add that lighting in and have a different opacity level that's a little more appropriate for that darker color. And sometimes you may find that the same thing happens while you're doing the shading. Maybe if you start shading a lighter color and then you need to shade a darker color, but it turns out you can't see the shading on the darker color because it's too faint, create a different shading layer and then use increased opacity so you can actually see the results of your shading. Now, the highlighting, it's looking a little strong here, so I'm going to actually take a slightly larger eraser brush and kind of tease that away to soften the edges, and you may need to do that occasionally, just so the highlighting doesn't look as harsh. You can try different shapes of highlights. For example, on Honchcrow's wing, there's this much larger patch. That's partially because it's a little bit further forward, but you can do a much bigger circle and then clean that up with the eraser. And again, as with the shading, you just continue to do this until you've added the image. The highlight areas are going to be a little smaller, there'll be fewer of them than there would be with the shading, but just add little light accents here and there wherever you feel they're needed. Now, as an additional note here, when I get to the beak and the legs, I'm going to do something a little bit different, and that is I'm going to, rather than make the highlights softer, I'm actually going to want to keep them pretty crisp looking, and maybe even a little bit brighter than that. That may require a third layer. One middle, maybe. Because the beak is a smoother surface than the rest of the body, which is mostly feathers, and the smoother a surface is, the brighter a highlight is going to look on it, basically. So we don't want the super soft edges on the beak highlight the way we do on the rest of his feathers. And then a little bit on the very tips of the talons over here, and even a little bit in the eyes. We're going to do stronger highlights in the eyes later, but for now that'll serve as a base. So he's got some basic highlights. It's really starting to look like some real Sugimori art now. And again, as with the shading, you do the same thing. So we've got light 1, now it's time for light 2, which will go on top of the light 1 layers. These are going to be much smaller, the light 2 part. Almost an accent to the original highlight layers. Maybe overlap a little bit. Just play with them again, adjust the opacity. We'll add light to dark now for the other, like this. until, I'm going to use the brush, you've got highlights wherever you feel like you need them on the image. And play with the opacity. And alright, so I've added highlights to just about everywhere that needs them, and it looks pretty close to done. You may want to keep playing with the opacity levels of things. For example, that still looks a little too bright there on the chest. I may want to lower these opacity levels. The highlights you're probably going to end up playing with more than anything else. They're, in my opinion, one of the hardest parts to get quite right. And the last step that you really need to complete is, remember I mentioned coming back to the eyes and adding that sort of sparkle to the irises. So we'll add that part last, again, right there on top. One more layer. But this time, after creating the layer and selecting the color, usually you want this to go, like I said, in the pupil or the iris. It's going to depend on the shape of your eye. You want a hard-edged brush, not a soft-edged one, but one something like this. And you're going to want it small, and because these eyes are small, you probably want to zoom in so you can actually see what you're doing. And then add light, not too much, that's a little big. And then maybe lower the opacity to only about 90%. It still needs to look very bright. There you really have it. He looks nice, he's got nice Sugimori-style highlighting and shading. From here on out, you can stop here if you want, or you can add a couple of extra finishing touches to the image to just make it look a little bit nicer before we clean it up and call it a day. One of the things you may want to do, especially if you're drawing something that's soft, you know, feathery like a bird, or fluffy like a dog or a cat or some other mammal, you may want to smudge up the edges of the shading and highlighting, like in the Dodrio example here. That gives it a slightly fuzzier look than just this flat circular shading like you have here. It looks a little less smooth. And we'll do a little bit of that. This guy's not quite as fluffy looking as Dodrio is, but we can add a little bit of that. So the way you usually do that is you go over here to the smudge tool, which is probably buried under here. And again, you might want to zoom in a little bit. And you take your smudge tool, a decent size, you really don't want it very big, and then you go to a couple of spots on the highlighting or shading. So for example, I'll go to the light to dark layer and just kind of pull at the edges and push at the edges of the light so it gives us this rough, jagged sort of edge. And do that basically wherever you feel you need the extra light. You know, make sure to get both parts of it. So I'll get this darker bit here, and it's just going to make it look a little rougher and more appropriate for feathers. I can do that to chest area, I can do that to the shading as well. Now I wouldn't want to do something like that most likely on the beak, again, because the beak is not a soft fluffy surface like these feathers. That's a little better off left smooth like that. But just play with it, tousle stuff up a little bit. If you look at some of these images, there's a lot of overlap, a lot of messing around with the light and shading. It's not just perfect lines and curves, so just continue to play with it until you think it looks decent. Now you may also want to blur the edges of your shadows and highlights just a little bit, in addition to smudging them. Photoshop has filters that you can use, just a simple blur filter, blur more to apply it just a little bit. You don't want to overdo it. If you want to apply it more than once, you can use the shortcut key, which is Control F, which applies the last filter you used. And then for usually just the regular shading and highlighting layers, obviously don't do this to the line art, and you don't really need to do it to the color either, but just smudge them a little bit, make them, the curves and lines and your smudging, a little softer. Once you've done that, that's really about it. The image is more or less done, and all that's left is to make sure it cleans up nicely and go ahead and save it. Cleaning it up just means, making any last minute adjustments, like, oh, maybe I don't like the second level of shading quite that dark, lower the opacity a little bit, and then cleaning up around the edges of your line art so there's no stray blobs of color that you might have missed. Now, most of the time there shouldn't be anything there, but for example, if you start smudging things or if you use the blur filter, you may cause some of the color to bleed outside the lines a little bit, and if I were to take this and put it on somewhere on the internet that had a dark background, you would see little smudges around it, and that's not going to look nice. So the easiest way to clean up the edges of your line art, or go to the line art layer, take your magic wand tool, and select the area outside of the image. Remember to make sure there aren't any enclosed areas that you also need to check. And then you expand that selection by just 1 pixel, so again it goes kind of under the line art. And then go over your shading and highlighting layers, and then just hit the delete key on each layer just once, and it will clear up anything that is inside that selection. In other words, anything that's gone outside of the lines. And that's it, we're ready to save it now. So usually, make sure you save the PSD file that you have, and then to get to the image that you're going to show to other people, I would go to here, Save for Web and Devices. This is going to open up a dialog box that may take a little bit to load. Give it a second. It's a big image, remember, so it needs a little time to think about it. And here we have our image. My God, that's huge. Now, if you want to keep the transparency in your image, and I imagine most of you are going to want that, you want it set to this PNG 24 from this drop down. That lets the colors and the shading continue to look nice and smooth, but allows you to preserve the transparency. You do not want PNG 8, that's going to make it look all pixelated and ugly. If you don't care about the shading, then it will make a smaller file generally if you use JPEG instead of PNG 24. I want transparency, so I'll have PNG 24. And then I'm just going to come down here and reduce the image size to anything you consider reasonable. I usually work with images, if the height is the tallest dimension, about 460 pixels high, no wider than 480 wide. So that's a nice manageable size. And then save the image. Save it wherever in your folder you'd like to save it. I'll just save it here as a PNG. It'll save the file. And then I can open it. And there you have it. A completed Sugimori-style fakemon image. And if you compare it to, let's stick it in there, let's see, Dojo right next to it, it doesn't look half bad. So, you've got your completed image. I hope that you found this little video useful. It's still going to take a lot of practice. You're probably not going to get it the first try. I've been doing this for more than 3 years, and there are still people out there who are a lot better than I am. But if you keep practicing and experimenting, the results will pay off. It'll look a little closer. You can add your own little touches to it. You're not necessarily going to like everything that Ken Sugimori does, so put your own spin on it. Make it a little more your own. You always want your art to have something of you in it. If you feel like you need a little extra instruction, there are plenty of nice tutorials available out there on the internet, including some for programs other than Photoshop. Again, you can do this in anything with layers. It's just a matter of knowing where the settings are, but you might be able to find a GIMP tutorial or a Paint Tool SCI tutorial that gives you slightly better instructions about your specific program and where to find the brushes and filters in your program. Look for tutorials, you can Google them, search deviantart.com. With a little extra practice, you'll be putting out art this nice in no time. So thanks again for watching, and keep practicing, and happy arting.